All right, welcome back to the final session of Day 2, Conclave 2022, The Legend of Curly's Gold. We have, that's going to stick now. We have our final session for the day with Joanne Leone, the Divine Feminine in Sethian Gnosticism. Joanne has been involved with the Apostolic Johannite Church since 2019 and serves as co-leader of Holy Sophia and Narthex in Melbourne. And she has recently become a seminarian of St. Raphael's Theological Seminary and is called to serve the Gnostic community via the pathway of teaching and advocacy for the Divine Feminine. Joanne is a researcher, archaeologist, and ancient historian, and is currently writing her thesis on the Roman mystery cults of the goddess Isis. Rock on. She has a deep love of antiquity and spends her time researching religious and mystical traditions of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, including the many iterations of Gnosticism, paganism, and Hellenistic Judaism. Joanne has a passion for the esoteric and the mystical and is an initiate of several groups and esoteric orders. She is particularly fond of Neoplatonism and has devoted her life to the pursuit of wisdom and gnosis. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eminence. I'm just going to share my screen. Alrighty, so hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the Divine Feminine in Sethian Gnosticism today. But before I do that though, I am speaking to you from the amazing city of Melbourne in Australia, and so I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today. The lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be viewing this presentation today in the audience or in the future. Just quickly as well, I'd like to acknowledge the people in the AJC that have kind of really supported me along my journey. Firstly, my gratitude to Bishop Tim Timotheus for being kind, supportive and encouraging of me every step of my spiritual journey within the AJC. My gratitude to Father Brendan for his inspiring devotion to the Divine Feminine and for being an amazing role model for what an inclusive priest looks like in action in the community. Also, my gratitude to my co-Narthex leader, Thomas, for being an excellent support for me and for allowing me to bring my knowledge and passion into discussion and leadership at our local meetings. I obviously want to thank my Narthex as well, our members, the community, and the greater members of the Australian and New Zealand diocese for indulging my historical nerdery and for asking me amazing questions and for allowing me to bring my academic research into a receptive public forum. And finally, my deepest gratitude to Deacon Angie, my sister and my mentor, and to Jen and Bishop Tim, who the four of us together form the Female Mystics group. And together they have provided unconditional support, laughter, quality memes, and fellowship in the dismembering of patriarchal attitudes, which have for far too long suppressed women, their spiritual experience, and the spirit of the Divine Feminine. So I guess this is the impetus of why I wanted to do this talk today, to bring more awareness to the Divine Feminine. So because I'm screen sharing, I can't see if anyone's making comments in the chat. So I will endeavour to address those at the end of the talk. I'm hoping not to go too long past the hour and then open it up for a bit of a discussion at the end. So yeah, hopefully looking forward to some good discussion. So the order of events as well, what we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to try and address the issue of what is Gnosticism. We're going to be looking at who are the Sethians, because obviously I'm talking about the Sethian branch of Gnosticism. We're going to be unpacking a little bit of their cosmology. Because I'm a historian, I love a bit of cultural context. So we're going to be understanding the factors that influence or have kind of grown to be a part of Sethian Gnosticism, including Hellenistic Judaism, Middle Platonism, and different iterations of the Divine Feminine, what that kind of looked like in that time period. I'm also going to be looking at language and gender. Getting into the Sethian literature, I'm going to be looking at the personification of wisdom, particularly made manifest in the Aeon Sophia. We're going to be looking at how Sophia is depicted in the Sethian literature. And then for the majority of the talk, I really want to be concentrating on the figure of Barbelo. So we're going to be looking at Barbelo, who she is, her personification, how she's depicted in 3 particular Sethian treatises, so the Apocryphon of John, the Trimorphic Protonoia, and the Gospel of the Egyptians. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the literary form of the aretologies. Don't worry, I'll explain what all these things are. We're going to be doing a little bit of a comparative aretology. As Zevinus mentioned, I'm currently writing my thesis about the goddess Isis, so I'm going to be incorporating or asking the question, does Isis influence the Sethian cult? And finally, I'm going to be looking at the legacy and importance of Barbelo and the divine feminine, and how that's going to be relevant for us as people living in the modern world in the 21st century. And then, of course, for all the nerds out there, I'm going to be giving a little bit of a further reading. So I'd first like to kind of address what is Gnosticism. And this is not really a new thing. Many people have kind of tried to address this issue. For example, the fantastic book by Karen King that you see on the left-hand side there. But also Michael Williams is kind of the first person to have tried to figure out what exactly is Gnosticism. So he defines it as an umbrella designation for a certain general type of religious expression that seems to have flourished in a particularly visible way in the Roman Empire during the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries of the Common Era. Now that's a little bit vague, and I think we can do a bit better than that. But really, there were probably people who called themselves the Gnostikoi in antiquity as early as the 2nd century CE, but the term is mostly known to us from heresiological writers, thanks to Irenaeus, who use it to designate a kind of a difficult to pin down and shifting group of what they perceive to be, or what Irenaeus and other heresiological writers seem to think of as rejected Christian teachings, heretical Christian teachings. However, Gnosticism is, we shouldn't really think of it as simply Christian heresy, and we shouldn't really see it as the heretical other when viewed alongside the development of Christian orthodoxy. The underlying factor when studying these groups as well is that there is an enormous amount of diversity within the contents of their literature, as evidenced in the Nag Hammadi corpus. And so the issue of categorization has become fundamental in modern scholarship, and that's why Michael Williams has sought to address this picture. All right, so moving on. Who are the Sethians? In the interest of time, I've tried to kind of really get the crux out of this. I've only really got an hour to encompass this whole topic. So if you have any questions, like I said, I'm happy to answer them at the end. So the word Sethian is not necessarily modern. It was initially used by Irenaeus and then later writers to designate or give a term to a particular group of people who were practicing and thinking in a certain way. The people themselves, they didn't kind of call themselves Sethian. And from what we can read in the literature, what they did call themselves were the Great Generation, the immovable, incorruptible race, the sons of light, the seed of Seth, the children of Seth, etc. So there's obviously a connection to Seth. Seth, of course, being the 3rd child of Adam and Eve. And really the Sethians kind of venerated Seth as the bearer and transmitter of the authentic image of the spiritual Adam. Overall, there are about, give or take, 14 treatises in the Nag Hammadi corpus that have been categorized as Sethian. I'm not going to go through all of those today, but the ones I will focus on today are, like I said, the Apocryphon of John, which we know has at least 4 copies, the Gospel of the Egyptians, also called the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, and the Trimorphic Protonoia, which is my favorite book. So most of the books in the Sethian corpus are an exegesis on the biblical book of Genesis. Some books contain a reworking of certain famous episodes in Genesis. So, for example, within the Gospel of the Egyptians, there is a mention and kind of a reworking of the Sodom and Gomorrah passage. So, fundamentally, though, within the Sethian corpus, the God of Genesis is equated with Yaldabaoth, a flawed and inferior entity, and they categorize this entity not as the supreme being. They also say that his acts are in direct parody to Plato's demiurge, which is a figure that is kind of described in the Timaeus. And finally, another characteristic about the Sethians is that the notion of Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree, which we see in Genesis, is equated with salvation through gnosis. It's not equated as a sin. So a little bit about the Sethian cosmology. I shamelessly stole this picture from the website Gnosis for All. Another shameless plug. It is an incredible website written by Gnostics for Gnostics. They read the academic literature so that you don't have to, and they make it kind of really palatable for everybody. So if you're looking for some more information about Gnosticism in general, I would definitely head over to Gnosis for All, of which I will be shortly become a contributor to as well. So what is inherent in Sethian doctrine? Well, there is a protology or a myth of origins. There's also a theogony, the narrative genealogy of the divine beings. There's a cosmogony, the narrative production of the world of daily experience, the material world. There's an anthropogony, the birth of the first human beings, with an inclusion of the origins of evil. And there's also soteriology. So there's this notion that humanity will be extricated from their precarious situation in a flawed world. There's an inherent self-understanding that these Gnostics originated as the seed of Seth. Seth is depicted as a heavenly and earthly saviour, but it's important to note he's only a saviour, or depicted as a saviour, to his progeny, to his seed, the children of Seth. Importantly, in the cosmology, there is a heavenly or pleromic trinity of Father, Mother, and Son. The Father is usually named as the invisible spirit, the Mother is named as Barbelo, and the Son is usually named as the autogenes. There is a division within the Aeon of Barbelo. Many kind of aeons and divine principles originate from the Aeon of Barbelo, and there's kind of too many to get into. And also to note, it kind of varies widely between texts as well. Overall, though, the last kind of aeons to be created within the pleroma are the four luminaries, and they usually originate from the sun, the autogenes, and they are the aeons of Harmazel, Oriel, Davathai, and Elaleth. Famously, the Aeon of Elaleth also contains within it the Aeon Sophia. So she's the last to be created in the pleroma, which we'll get into a little bit later. Within these four luminaries, there is a triad or tetrad of ministers, and each kind of serve the luminary in some way. There is the creation and evil nature of the demiurge. That's kind of categorically Sethian. And this demiurge kind of actively works to destroy the seed of Seth. He creates the archons, who most scholars liken to the fallen angels of first Enoch. There's a definite division of history into different ages or epochs within the Sethian literature, and that's typically categorized by the appearance of the saviour in each of those ages, specifically to the sons of Seth. There's obvious use of a lot of really difficult philosophical terminology in a lot of the Sethian literature. And some people think there is a bit of a secondary Christianization, and we do kind of see tropes of that within some of the books. But overall, I wouldn't designate the Sethian cosmology as inherently Christian in any way. And finally, something that's really kind of only in the Sethian literature is this kind of vague allusion to what people kind of think is a baptismal rite. It's usually called the ritual of the 5 seals. It's incredibly elusive and complex. And some Sethian texts as well also include some kind of ascension ritual as well. So we did see those kind of tropes repeated in what Deacon John was saying yesterday with the Chaldean oracles. So there is that kind of ascension ritual. So a bit of cultural context. So I kind of just want to situate us now within the time period that I'm talking about. So we're firmly within the 2nd and 3rd century CE. And this is usually categorized as the Roman period. But before I get into the Roman period, I do want to kind of get into the Hellenistic period, which immediately preceded it. So this strapping man on the screen here, if you don't know who that is, that's Alexander the Great. So I'm not going to get into his backstory, but he dies in 323 BCE. One of his generals, Ptolemy, takes over as ruler of Egypt and kind of ushers in the end of the dynastic period of Egypt and the beginning of the Ptolemaic period. And one of the defining moments that Ptolemy I has as ruler is the kind of widespread Hellenization of Egypt. He revitalizes Egyptian culture, incorporating elements of classical Greek religious thought and cultural practice. But I do have to say that the Hellenization is not kind of only seen in Egypt, it's kind of widespread throughout what was Alexander's empire. One of the most significant things that Ptolemy did was to pour a lot of money and time into establishing the city of Alexandria as the cultural and educational capital of his empire. This, of course, as a result of that, came the Alexandrian school, which comprised of the most renowned scholars of the empire who would come together to study at the Library of Alexandria. And there was also this kind of intercultural exchange, this sharing of ideas about philosophy, literature, the natural sciences, art. So it was really kind of a cosmopolitan, completely academic kind of practice. So there was also the widespread Hellenization of Egyptian religious practice, and that's synchronized Egyptian and Greek deities together. The kind of most prominent deities to come out of this period are, of course, the goddess Isis, who became syncretized with the Greek goddesses Aphrodite, Demeter, Persephone, and others. And there's also the creation of her consort, Serapis, who was a combination of Zeus, Dionysus, Hades, mixed a little bit with Osiris and the Apis bull. And together, these Isiac deities kind of became an incredible influence in the Hellenistic period onwards. And so this kind of cultural, religious, historical legacy of the Hellenistic period carries on over into the Roman period, which is the period that we're kind of going to be concentrating on today. So here up on the screen is a map of the city of Alexandria. It is a map a little bit later in the 4th century, but basically everything's the same in the time period that we're thinking about. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but just in case you can't, in the red circles there, I've kind of located the kind of most famous and prominent things when people think about when they think of Alexandria, and that is the Jewish quarter up in the top right-hand side there. On the top left here is the lighthouse of Pharos, and the lower circle below that is actually the location of the Library of Alexandria. And fun fact, everyone seems to know about the library, but they also don't know that adjacent or in front of the library was the Museum of Alexandria, and that actually came before the library. Also in blue here, I've located 3 separate temples of Isis, which is, I guess, going to become a little bit more important when I kind of talk about Isis and Barbelo a little bit later on in the talk. But I now want to just talk a little bit about the Roman period. So, of course, we know the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt is famously Cleopatra VII. After her death and the death of Mark Antony, Augustus incorporates the land of Egypt into the Roman Empire, and that's in 27 BCE in the 1st century. Culturally, not much changes in Egypt. Politically, there's a bit of restructuring of the government in Egypt. But one thing to kind of come out of the Roman period is the explosion and rapid spread of the cults of Isis and Serapis all over the Mediterranean. In terms of religious practice, the temples in Egypt are virtually kind of left alone, and they kind of flourish in their own right. Alexandria is still a flourishing cultural and intellectual hub. And because of this kind of milieu, this kind of becomes a hotbed, or kind of sets the scene for later exploration of Christian ideas. And I guess at this point, we're also going to be looking specifically at the Sethians. But it's important to note as well that kind of alongside the Sethians comes the Valentinian school of Gnosticism, which is also beginning to flourish at this time. And also a little bit later, in the later 3rd century, there are the reforms of Diocletian, which herald in the growth of Christianity, especially within the context of Egypt. And I'd just like to point out finally that in this time period, we also see the Coptic language emerging as the primary literary language amongst Christian groups in Roman Egypt. So I now want to go into a little bit about the other kind of cultural practices that were happening in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, which have a profound influence on Sethian Gnosticism. So a little bit about Hellenistic Judaism. So obviously the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 CE in the 1st century. So Temple Judaism from that point is no longer practiced, as there's obviously no longer a temple. The priesthood loses its ritual function and is largely disbanded. There is a thriving Jewish community in Alexandria, as I showed you before. There's the Jewish quarter there, and that was the Jews were established in Alexandria virtually from the time that it was built. But it's also important to note that there is a large and thriving Jewish community all kind of spread throughout the entirety of Egypt as well. So Hellenistic culture, of course, had a profound impact on the customs and practices of Jews, both in the land of Israel and in the diaspora, so throughout Egypt. The Hellenistic period also saw the merging of Jewish mythology with Greek philosophical ideas. And by no means was this kind of a new thing, or was this only happening in the Hellenistic period. For example, in the 2nd century BCE, Jewish scholars Artapanus and Aristobulus of Panias were drawing connections between traditions. And there's this really interesting take, actually. So Moses was elevated in status, and the books of Moses were named as the summit of philosophy. Moses was postulated as the teacher of Pythagoras and subsequently of all the Greek philosophers and lawgivers. So there's this kind of really fascinating tradition of viewing Moses as the kind of preeminent philosopher, or the philosopher of the philosophers. The most prominent Hellenized Jew, of course, was this handsome man on screen, Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century BCE to the mid-1st century CE. And he's quite notable for producing a synthesis of both traditions, so Judaism and Greek philosophy. And the foundations that Philo begins to postulate here become pivotal in establishing the foundations for the development of Christian theology in the West from his time period onwards. His work has a huge influence on the theologians Clement of Alexandria, and also Christian apologists such as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen. Philo wrote a book called Inquiries, and it is basically a verse-by-verse exposition on the books of Genesis and Exodus with a Platonic twist, and that's going to become important when we think about the Sethians. Philo is a lover of Plato, and he is persuaded by Plato's cosmology. He not only finds similarities in Platonic doctrine, but says that Plato's teachings are evident in Genesis, but to the credit of Moses. I'd also like to mention, before we move on, that there is a tradition of interpretatio Graecae and interpretatio Iudaicae. So basically what that means is culturally educated Greeks would take Egyptian and Jewish mythology, cosmology, and kind of interpret it through the lens of Greek philosophy or Greek culture. And this, I guess, becomes really important in the context of Sethian Gnosticism. So finally, onto Middle Platonism. Most people agree that what sets kind of Middle Platonism apart is that it's largely inspired by Pythagorean philosophy and involves the discussion of a primordial generative pair of first principles, the one and the dyad. And people are thinking about how to kind of square this doctrine with the account of creation given in the Timaeus. So in this period, pretty much everyone's obsessed with the Timaeus, and it's kind of the most prominent of Plato's dialogues that kind of gets discussed in this time period. But in our discussion of the Sethians, I would like to draw attention to three prominent Middle Platonists. So the first, living in the 1st century CE, was Moderatus of Gades. And he kind of really pioneered the development of Neo-Pythagoreanism. According to Porphyry and Simplicus, Moderatus posited a 4-level metaphysics based on the Old Academy of Plato and the Pythagoreans. So Moderatus posited that the supreme principle is the first one, beyond being and all essence. This is followed by a second one, who is a true determinate being, intelligible, and is in the forms. He also posited that the self-deprivation of the first one allows the second one to become the receptacle of unity and form, which goes on to yield multiplicity. And this was kind of a little bit of an adaptation of Plato's receptacle or infinite dyad for the Platonists in the audience. The second that I'd like to draw attention to is Numenius of Apamea, living contemporaneous with the Sethian period in the late 2nd century. He was a Neo-Pythagorean or a Pythagorean Platonist who was determined to establish a philosophical genealogy from Pythagoras to Plato. Included in that genealogy was the acceptance of non-Greek philosophical traditions, such as those of the Brahmins, the Jews, the Magi, and the Egyptians. Numenius understands that both Plato and Moses conceptualized the first principle, that is, and can kind of conflated God with capital B being. He diverged from Plato, though, specifically concerning the distinction between the first God and the demiurge. He was also kind of the first to kind of really think about or to write about the human body as a prison for the soul. And this is something that kind of really gets picked up in the Sethian tradition. There's a great quote on the right-hand side, if you haven't read it already. We don't actually have any surviving fragments from Numenius, but he is recorded in other texts. This one here is from Eusebius. And so he says, the true existence is identical with the first God, existing in and by itself, that is with good, and is defined as spirit or nous. But as the first absolute God existing in itself and being undisturbed in its motion could not be creative, the demiurge, he thought that we must assume a second God who keeps matter together, directs its energy to it and to intelligible essences, and imparts its spirit to all creatures. Its mind is directed to the first God, in whom it beholds the ideas according to which it arranges the world harmoniously, being seized with the desire to create the world. So here we can really kind of see the kind of the philosophical underpinnings, or the kind of ideas that are kind of coming to the fore and expressed within the context of Sethian Gnosticism. And the last philosopher, the Middle Platonist I want to look at here is Plutarch, who's again contemporaneous. He's living in the 2nd century CE. And what is new in Plutarch's scheme is the addition, or he kind of uses this Egyptian ontological framework to map Platonic philosophical principles onto. There's a definite introduction of a second evil soul or evil principle, which is indirect, which is an antagonist to the one. It is in direct opposition to the supreme deity. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, that interpretatio Graecae. Plutarch kind of uses the ontological framework or the mythological framework of the Egyptian pantheon, of the Egyptian creation story, particularly with Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and kind of maps that onto a Platonic framework. And this is most evident in his work on Isis and Osiris, which is a component of the Moralia. So finally, in this section, I want to look at different iterations of the divine feminine and how that was expressed in this time. So in a Jewish context, of course, we have the personification of wisdom, the feminine entity, which is evident in the book of Proverbs and in Sirach. A little bit later on, we also have the Shekinah, who is present in the Torah. She conceptually dwells within the cloud in post-exile in the book of Exodus, who goes on to protect the Jewish people. She dwells within the holiest places. She rests in the Ark, the Holy of Holies, and in the tabernacle. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the one and only Margaret Barker, who postulates this theory of, in the First Temple period, the Great Lost Lady. Barker proposes a pre-Semitic inclusion of the divine feminine embodied in the Ugaritic goddess Asherah. So, of course, we have those kind of, that's the kind of background, the Jewish background that's kind of coming in or influencing the divine feminine there. In a Platonic context, of course, we have the Timaeus, and Plato is kind of using really kind of specific imagery to talk about his higher order concepts. So all phenomena, he says, are images and are the offspring or children of their father, the forms emerging and existing within the volume of their mother, or the all-receiving nature, also called the receptacle or nurse of becoming. So there's this kind of mother-father dynamic that's happening there. Like a mirror, the receptacle or the mother receives and reflects the images of the forms or of the father, enabling the divine and cosmic to become defined as distinguishable things within the context of the mother. And this is something that we really see in the kind of the manifestation of Barbelo and her interaction with the father. So Plato's ultimate principles were the one and kind of opposing feminine principle, the infinite dyad, characterized as the many and the few, the great and the small, the more, the less, the unequal, etc. In a pagan context, and what I mean by pagan in this time period is specifically Greek and Roman, the divine feminine is everywhere. Most importantly, in this time period, as I've already mentioned and will mention a bit later again, is the goddess Isis. So she's kind of the most preeminent goddess in this time. She's all over the Mediterranean. Everybody's worshipping Isis. And she's kind of a really accessible goddess for people of kind of all social classes. So again, finally, a little bit about language and gender that we kind of have to be aware of. So obviously within the Greek language, like many other languages, has nouns of different genders. An ancient Greek noun is either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Similar in Coptic, all Coptic nouns carry grammatical gender, either masculine or feminine, and are usually marked through a prefix definite article, and which is also common in many of the Romance languages. Notably, 40% of the vocabulary of literary Coptic is drawn from the Greek language, although the core of the Coptic language is mostly Egyptian. and closely relates to the Demotic Egyptian language, which immediately preceded it. Again, in a Platonic context, Plato uses kind of overt feminine metaphors and female characters to describe his higher order principles. Women are usually assigned to the role of reproduction or generation. And many of Plato's presentations honor elements of the feminine. Gender-specific experience is understood and preserved in the figurative language of Plato's era, which again is, I guess, for Plato is the 5th century BCE, and linguistically it's Greek. So they're all things to keep in mind. So that's kind of a bit about the cultural and historical background, but now I kind of want to get into the crux of the presentation, which is understanding what the divine feminine is in a Sethian context, of course. So I first kind of want to think about the personification of wisdom and how that's made manifest in the Aeon Sophia. So the personification of wisdom in a Jewish context, of course, and I'm talking about in a biblical Jewish context here, in an ancient Jewish context, we kind of have 2 iterations of wisdom. So we have the wisdom of Proverbs, and this is kind of an aretological text as well in Proverbs, where the character of wisdom kind of describes her function and role in creation. She just says her realm and domain is both the cosmos and all of humanity. She exists from the primordial being in a hidden form. She must be sought. She's created by God in the beginning, before the creation that happens in Genesis. And that's really important, that notion of before creation. She appears, is recognized, and is honored. She is the syzygy of God, or the divine pair, but contradictorily, she's also alone. She has, and yeah, she's kind of full of contradictions. She has a lot of contradicting aspects. She's a wife, a mother, beloved, virgin. There's kind of all these kind of concepts that are kind of happening. And because she's kind of syncretic in this way, it's impossible to determine one possible historic origin. But we do kind of understand that this kind of wisdom character in Proverbs is the inheritor of a rich kind of mythological background. And then we have the wisdom that's depicted in Sirach 24. So we have a clearly defined Jewish iteration of wisdom. Again, we have another aretology. And there's the kind of the adaptation of the wisdom myth to Jewish thought here. There's still tropes of favoring a particular people, in this case, obviously the Israelites, who have been firmly established in Jerusalem at this time. But there's also kind of a little bit of an Egyptian influence there. So in Sirach, the first line here, I came forth from the mouth of the Most High. Well, in Judaism, God creates, nothing comes forth, especially not from his mouth. But kind of in the same kind of cultural context, we see the kind of creation and coming forth from the mouth clearly in Egyptian cosmology, particularly in the hymn of Atum, where he spews forth in creation the gods Shu and Tefnut. So that's kind of the Jewish kind of background, or the biblical background, to the personification of wisdom. And I want to now have a look at the Aeon Sophia and how she's depicted in the Sethian literature. So Sophia overall in the Sethian literature isn't really as fundamental a figure as the figure of Barbelo. Sophia is really used as a narrative feature to explain the presence of evil in the world and how kind of the world, or the material realm, came to be created. She is used to further philosophical exploration for the nature of the demiurge. Her function does not really incorporate the multiplication of feminine generative principles. She's kind of really on her own. And she's ontologically the lowest aeon and is associated with disorder and chaos. Interestingly, as we see in the Apocryphon of John, Sophia's consort is never to blame. It's that old tired notion of blaming the feminine. But but there is a kind of definitive understanding that Sophia is kind of uncontrolled, or, you know, she's supposed to be controlled by a masculine counterpart, but she kind of is a bit unruly. And good for her. So her relevance to the narrative kind of differs widely between the Sethian books, as we'll see in a moment. And in some ways, she's kind of written as a counterpoint to the enormity of power that's inherent in Barbelo. And so I guess we can kind of look at the pleroma being sandwiched between two kind of powerful iterations of the divine feminine. On the one hand, in the higher order, we have Barbelo, and on the lower hand, we have Sophia. So let's have a little bit of a look now how she's actually depicted in the Sethian literature. And to be honest, it's kind of it differs a lot between the different books. On the left-hand side here, we have the Sophia episode from the Apocryphon of John, and really the Apocryphon of John kind of seems to be the only book that kind of really delineates the Sophia myth. So I guess, though, within the broader structure of Sethian literature, Sophia is always the last aeon, as I mentioned before, connected to the realm of Elaleth. She is wisdom. Sophia literally means wisdom in Greek. And she, within the realm of Elaleth, there's usually wisdom, perfection, and peace. So it's kind of a tripartite thing. And also important to note, in Sethian literature, her consort is never named. In fact, none of the kind of, male entities are they're never named. So in the Apocryphon of John, the Sophia episode begins because Sophia begins to think for herself. But it's important here, everyone kind of likes to hate on Sophia, how she ushered in all this chaos and hatred and evil into the world without the consent of the father, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, I don't think that's accurate. And the reason I say that is because we can have a look now at a close reading of the text. So it happened that the realm, or the aeon of wisdom, Sophia, of conceptual thought, epinoia, began to think for herself. She used the thinking and the foreknowledge of the invisible spirit. She intended to reveal an image from herself, to do so without the consent of the spirit, who did not approve, without the thoughtful assistance of her masculine counterpart, who did not approve, without the invisible spirit's consent, without the knowledge of her partner, she brought it into being, etc., etc. So she intends to reveal an image of herself. This, and specifically through the use of the epinoia there, of the prognosis, she does this through a reflection of the Father's creation that's made manifest in Barbelo. And this epinoia and prognosis is something that we're going to get to when I get into the Barbelo section. Of course, yes, Sophia does create without the consent of the Spirit, that is, of the Father. But I guess that's kind of hard to kind of conceptualize and understand if the text has just told us that she's kind of using the higher order concepts of Barbelo in order to think for herself in the first place. Sophia, as an aeon, is endowed with unconquerable power, and she kind of gives birth to a, quote, misshapen being unlike herself, end quote. It changed into the form of a dragon with a lion's head with eyes flashing like lightning bolts. Overall, though, in the Apocryphon of John, Sophia does recognize her ignorance. She surrounds her creation with a cloud, names him Yaldabaoth, and the rest is history. Everyone knows what happens after that. I'd like to contrast that kind of mythology, that kind of narrative, though, with what we see in the trimorphic protonoia. And so literally this is the only thing mentioned about Sophia in the trimorphic protonoia. So Barbelo here is the one that's speaking. She's the protagonist of the book, and she claims Sophia is innocent. So here we see in the text, Yaldabaoth, he who had taken power, who had snatched it away from the innocent one, Sophia, who had earlier overpowered her, who is the lights epinoia, who had descended her from whom he had come forth from originally. And that's literally the only line or mention of Sophia. So I guess this also, it draws us a little bit of a different picture, right? So whereas in the Apocryphon of John, Sophia is understanding what she's doing. She's deliberately creating because, for whatever reason, she wants to kind of emulate the father. But in the trimorphic protonoia, it seems to suggest that Sophia is this kind of really passive and innocent influence. And it's a little bit unclear from just reading this passage alone, but does Yaldabaoth have his own agency? Is he already a part of Sophia? Does he kind of, rip away from Sophia? It's kind of a bit unclear, but overall the vibe is that Sophia is this kind of more passive entity than what we see in the Apocryphon of John. So what I don't have on screen is the kind of Sophia narrative from the Gospel of the Egyptians. But really kind of that also paints Sophia as this kind of really passive character. It says, and there appeared a cloud whose name is Hillik Sophia. Of course, there are many lacunas in this text, which is very frustrating, specifically at this section. But it goes on to say, she looked out on the paths of the chaos, her face being like in her form of blood. And the great angel Gamaliel spoke to the great Gabriel, the minister of the great light Oriel. He said, let an angel come forth in order that he may reign over the chaos and Hades. So here we have, again, a very different iteration of the creation narrative and the agency of Yaldabaoth, but also the impact and the participation within that creation of Sophia. So again, we can say, I think it's a mistake to say, the Sethians believe XYZ, because when we read the literature, we can see that there are very different iterations of the figure Sophia, of the creation in general, and particularly of the nature of the demiurge. But now I wanted to kind of turn to Barbelo. But Barbelo is infinitely more interesting than Sophia. And as you can probably tell, she's my favorite character within the Sethian corpus. So who is Barbelo? And it's incredible. That's an incredibly complex question. I've kind of put together this little diagram to help us kind of conceptualize who Barbelo is according to the Apocryphon of John. But I think fundamentally, if you only take one thing from this diagram, it's that although the name Barbelo is at the end there, Barbelo is an aeon, so she's all encompassing. So all of these things here are actually encompassing the aeon, or the kind of the makeup of Barbelo. So Barbelo is the first thought, the enoia, in the image and spirit of the Father. She is, the Apocryphon of John says, she is from his image in his light, perfect in power, image of the invisible, perfect Virgin Spirit. And again, so the first thought is expressed in slightly different ways, but fundamentally they're all part of the Aeon Barbelo. So here we have enoia, which is the thought and light of the Father, which kind of really kind of conceptualizes the act of thinking in and of itself. We have the pronoia, the forethought of the Father, also called providence. We have epinoia, the afterthought. We have protenoia, the first thought. And this is kind of categorized as the first self-aware thought. And all of these elements together, as I said, make up the aeon of Barbelo. It's important to note, though, that this multifaceted manifestation of Barbelo represents her role and essence prior to the creation. And what I mean by creation is kind of anything that she decides to create onwards. So from Barbelo onwards, in terms of the creation of the pleroma, is what I'm understanding as the creation, not the, the subsequent creation of humanity, etc., that comes way, way, way down the line. So I think overall Barbelo is expressed and described in these differentiations to help the reader and community understand and unpack the deeply intellectual philosophy that is contained within this cosmological narrative. These ideas together are pre-existent in contrast to the beings that come later and are manifest in the lower aeons. So this is kind of a really kind of lofty conceptual philosophical understanding, you know, kind of caught up in the image of Barbelo. So looking at her personification, so this is kind of what I'm talking about with creation. I've tried to put a line here. Anything above the line is the first creation, and anything below is the second creation. So Barbelo is the second feminine principle in the Gnostic trinity of Father, Mother, and Son. She appears under numerous names within Sethian literature, such as the Mother, the Thought, Forethought, First Thought, Aeon Giver, etc. She's also described as the living waters. She's described using the metaphor of a mirror. She reflects the light of the Father. She is paradoxical and full of contradictions. She's noted as the triple male. She is both the father and the mother of the aeons. She is the male virgin. And here, virgin has the connotation of non-sexual generation because she can self-generate. And I think this is something to really focus in on, because we do see sexual reproduction later on, but that is always associated with the archons. And in fact, they go on to rape Eve, which is how the Sethians conceptualize the birth of Cain and Abel. Barbelo is the invisible triple power. She can beget and give form. And this is her unique attribute. The Father cannot give form, only she can. Her power extends to all aeons. In fact, in the trimorphic protonoia, she says, I am in all things. I am in the archons and the demons. So that in itself is quite an interesting concept. She is the divine androgyne. She is singular, yet she is many. She is the Trinity, yes, yet she is also one component of the Trinity. She is the consort of the Father. She is the Ogdoad. She is the conception and manifestation of the thought of the Father. She is Plato's second one, as explained by Moderatus, which I mentioned before. Her connection to thought always depicts her as female and as mother. She is mother of the aeons, mother of the divine autogenes. She is the womb of everything. She is in all things. She is the perfect reflection and light of the Father. She is the Christ, the Savior. In trimorphic protonoia, she says she put on the robe of the Christ. Everyone thought she was Christ. She is the essence of Christ. She is the Christos, the anointed one. She also anoints. She anoints the autogenes. She anoints with eternal glory of the invisible spirit. And there's always this current motif of three that always is associated with Barbelo. She's thrice or triple, and kind of that kind of imagery is an adjective commonly used in ancient Greek to emphasize the greatest power of something. And of course, we have the example there of Hermes Trismegistos, the thrice great Hermes. So mentioning something three times means, you know, it's kind of really hitting home. Three, the number three also manifests unity in multiplicity, since the Gnostic trinity of Father, Mother, and Son are understood to be one. And it also implies the power to multiply whilst remaining unified. So I just want to quickly look at how she's manifest in three of the Sethian books here. So in the Apocryphon of John. So in general, the Apocryphon of John contains the most extensive recounting of the Sethian creation myth. Barbelo is described as, quote, the first power, the glory, Barbelo, the perfect glory in the aeons, the glory of the revelation, unquote. All subsequent acts of creation within the divine sphere, save crucially that of the lowest aeon sphere, occurs through Barbelo's co-action with the Father. Barbelo is named as second to the Father. She is the self-aware thought, the epinoia of the Father. The realm of the Father and Barbelo is kind of conceptualized as Barbelo arising from the Father. The first thought is the image. She then asks the Father for foreknowledge. And from this point onwards, I kind of term this the primary the structure of the divine, of the pleroma. Barbelo asks for incorruptibility, she asks for everlasting life, and she asks for truth. And along with foreknowledge and thought, those five concepts together kind of conceptualize the fivefold realm of the Father. The Apocryphon of John also mentions that this specifically, the fivefold realm of the Father, is actually 10, which implies that they are kind of, you know, androgynous or have some kind of male and female counterparts. In the secondary structure, according to the creation of Barbelo, in the Apocryphon of John, the Father looks into Barbelo and conceives a spark of light. This spark of light is similar but not equal to her blessedness, and is termed the only begotten child of the pure light, the autogenes. At the very end of the Apocryphon of John, of course, is the Providence hymn, which is similar in linguistic style to the trimorphic protonoia. It's an aretology. So Barbelo in the trimorphic protonoia, I could not find any images of a female savior. This is what came up. So yeah, hence the Wonder Woman reference there. So within the trimorphic protonoia, Barbelo is the protagonist of the entire book. There are four kind of distinct parts to the text: the hymn, the first hymn or introduction, and three subsequent descents of Barbelo in her guise as savior into the lower realm. She is the heavenly redeemer. Her first descent, or all her descents actually, are categorized by distinct appearances. So in her first descent, she appears as the Father, also named the Voice, and she descends to speak and permeate her voice amongst the underworld. She awakens humanity or makes them aware of her existence. Her second descent is as the Mother, categorized as sound. She comes again in the likeness of a female, specifically to awaken the sons of light, or the seed of Seth, the Sethians. There is a revelation of time and how this aeon is constructed and how it was created in darkness. She specifically comes to break the bonds of fate and sets the sons of light free from the influence of the archons. Her third and final descent is as the Son, called the Word or Logos. She comes again in the likeness of a female, but is supported by her male child, the autogenes. This book this descent contains two kind of first-person narratives, which can get quite confusing from the perspective of the Son and of Barbelo. She says the Son has come to illumine those who dwell in darkness, and then more mysteries are revealed to the sons of light, the Sethian. And finally, there is a kind of unfolding of this baptismal rite of the five seals, which is incredibly complex and kind of elusive. Finally, the way Barbelo is depicted in the Gospel of the Egyptians, she is described as the second Ogdoad, the virginal mother who presides over heaven. After she kind of helps to unfold the creation of the pleroma, each aeon after it is created looks back and gives praise to her. The main kind of protagonist of the Gospel of the Egyptians is the heavenly Seth. Seth goes on to create a whole bunch of aeons as well, and after that occurs, he and the aeon both give praise to Barbelo. And in the Gospel of the Egyptians as well, Seth takes the form of the Savior. So he kind of takes the direct role that Barbelo plays in the trimorphic protonoia. So I want to move on now to the concept of aretologies. So I've mentioned this word a few times in connection with the Sethians, so I kind of really now want to unpack what that means. So the aretologies are a popular literary form. What they are basically is they're a sacred or a literary form of a sacred biography. It's always a first-person speech from a particular deity, and the attributes of the deity are listed in the form of a poem or text, like I said, always in the first person, and they're always self-praising in nature. Our earliest examples of aretologies date from the 1st century BCE and are always in the context of the goddess Isis, and they're kind of widespread throughout the Mediterranean. Here is a bit of a map that I plotted of the location of specifically Isiac aretologies. And as you can see, they're kind of widespread out through the Mediterranean, but we do find earlier examples of this in Egypt. For example, in the hymns of Isidorus, in the Oxyrhynchus papyrus, in the invocation of Isis from Saqqara, in the hymn of Isis from Teptunis. And it's also important to note that the Isis aretologies predate any of the Christological aretologies, which of course come later. So I wanted to have a look and do a bit of a comparison with the aretologies. So the text in the middle here is from the Kyme aretology in Asia Minor, dated to between the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, found at the Isis sanctuary in Kyme. And I've kind of just pulled out a couple of lines here. The aretology is quite long, but I wanted to kind of do a bit of a side-by-side comparison about some of the themes that are present in the aretologies that are also present in the Sethian literature, specifically in connection to Barbelo. So here Isis says, I divided earth from heaven. In the trimorphic protonoia, Barbelo says, it is we also who alone have separated from the visible world. So kind of the same themes are here. Isis says, I showed initiations to humans. Barbelo says, I will reveal to you my mysteries, since you are my fellow brethren, and you shall know them all. So again, the same kind of vibe is happening here. Isis frees those in chains, and Barbelo says, every bond I loosened from you, and the chains of the demons of the underworld I broke. These things which are bound on my members, restraining them. And then finally in blue here, what's really kind of interesting in this period is that Isis is always depicted as a goddess who has dominion over fate. And this is kind of really unheard of in any other period and in any other god or goddess. This characteristic is very unique to Isis. In her aretology, she says, I conquered fate. To me, fate listens. And as we heard yesterday in Deacon John's talk, the Sethians are kind of obsessed with fate. We can see here this entire passage on the left-hand side here from the Apocryphon of John, talking about fate is hard, fate is stronger than the gods, the authorities, the demons. Fate is the lord of it all. So really fate is kind of, fate kind of pushes the passions onto you. It's something that's kind of an incredibly destructive force in a person's life. On the right-hand side, we have the trimorphic protonoia, and at first glance, this passage doesn't really seem to have anything in connection to fate. But on a close reading, we can actually extrapolate out from that Barbelo is specifically mentioning the kind of 7 planetary archons. And she's specifically saying about how they place bonds on people, and that in her capacity as savior, she has come to free those from their fate. So, of course, as you know, I'm writing my thesis on Isis, and I can't help but see a lot of similarities between Isis and Barbelo, and it kind of brings up these questions for me. Is there an influence of the cult of Isis, or Isis specifically, in Barbelo? So here on the screen, I've got a few lines from one of the hymns of Isidorus, hymn number 1 from the 1st century BC in Egypt. And I'm kind of want to draw attention here to some of the portions that I've highlighted in reference to Isis being this kind of omnipotent goddess, this queen of the gods, this greatly renowned Deo, highest discoverer of all life. Because of you, heaven and the whole earth have their being. Mighty one, deathless savior, many named. O one whose name has great power. And you can kind of see how, these attributes of Isis are kind of made manifest in Barbelo. But I think overall it's oversimplistic to say that Barbelo is Isis, but I can definitely see a lot of similarities between the two, particularly with how Isis is depicted in the aretologies and within the context of Platonic literature as well. There is an abundance of references to Isis in the Middle Platonic literature. So again, Isis at the time, or in the 2nd century, was a huge and major goddess. Her cult was kind of all over the ancient world or in the Mediterranean. But she was also a key thing here in connection to kind of tying this all together, was that she was also a goddess that the philosophers incorporated into Platonic philosophy in order to kind of bring an embodiment to higher order principles. And we see this especially in Plutarch on his treatise on Isis and Osiris as part of the Moralia. We see this in Apuleius's Metamorphosis, or the Golden Ass. Apuleius himself was a prominent Middle Platonist and a Platonic philosopher. We see it later on in the 4th century, or during the 4th and 5th century, in the Hermetic treatises, the Korikosmou, where Isis is used as a protagonist. She's used as the teacher in order to teach kind of the higher order mysteries to her son Horus, similar to, you know, what we see in the Asclepius, for example. Isis takes on this role of creator, of cosmocrator, queen of the gods and creator of the world. She is omnipotent. She's able to control fate and helps people to escape from the chains of fate. And like I said a little bit before, this concept is really unique in this time period. If we look back in a classical Greek context, no god or goddess was able to overcome fate. This was, you know, fate was something that the gods have no dominion over. We of course have the goddess Tyche, who was the embodiment of chance, a dispenser of good fortune or ill fortune. We have Moira, or the Moirai, the 3 goddesses of fate who determined human destiny. We have Ananke, which is the force of restraint or necessity, a personification of inevitability and compulsion. So the Greeks are thinking about fate in a kind of multifaceted way. And here we see Isis depicted as Agatha Tyche in the 2nd line here. She's omnipotent. The word Agatha connects her to her consort Serapis in his function as Agathodaimon, symbolizing good health, good wisdom, good fortune. And of course, Tyche here connects her again to the Greek goddess of fortune. There's also a philosophic concept that kind of comes to the fore in the Aretologies, this notion of to he marmenon, literally translated as I overcome fate. It's a concept meaning the control of fate, and this is a concept that is discussed greatly in all kinds of philosophical literature in the 2nd century, especially by the Stoics and then by the Middle Platonists. And again, Isis was the only goddess in this time period who was able to have any control of fate. And I think through the integration of Platonic philosophy, through that exploration or obsession that the Gnostics have over fate, I think that the embodiment of Isis in the character of Barbelo, or certainly the kind of the same features, really comes to the fore. I think there's definitely a connection there. So finally, and thanks for sticking with me. I know it's been a long one, but I wanted to kind of just think a little bit about the legacy and importance of Barbelo. Like, who cares? Why is she important? Why is the divine feminine important to us living in the modern world? Well, the Sethian literature is the earliest Gnostic literature that we have. As we've seen today, the divine feminine is a crucial component of the philosophical and cosmological underpinnings of ancient Gnosticism. I'm wondering, you know, considering the importance of Barbelo, why we don't see any kind of iteration of the divine feminine in early Christianity, irrespective of Mary, of course. And I think the blanket answer, or, you know, the automatic answer of, well, oh, it was heretical, according to the early church fathers, is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's fundamentally important to have a reverence and understanding of the importance and primacy of the divine feminine in foundational Gnostic literature, which helps us to understand and connect to Barbelo, or the divine feminine, as a divine principle. She is in all of us. That's what she says. She is the sacred flame that is inherent within all things. And I think it's important to usher in a welcoming of the divine feminine back into our lives, as this, I think, is a crucial component of our spiritual well-being. The feminine is an inherent part of all beings and has been ignored and suppressed for far too long. I think as modern Gnostics, it's important for us to recognize and reclaim our heritage, which was deliberately suppressed and taken from us. And I think it's important for us to reclaim the divine feminine as an important part of our tradition and of our practice. So that is all from me. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
It was fantastic, and in both intense and detailed. And I just want to say, just as a side comment, not even touching upon the content of the thing itself, that just it was a thing for me to sit here when you opened your talk and you had the acknowledgement. I think I had a flickering feeling of what it must feel like to be a proud grandpa. Because I've been with the AJC for a long time, so I remember when it was a couple of people in a room, and now there's subsequent generations of folks delving into particularly exactly this type of stuff. And going in directions and delving deep and kind of restoring, both the detail and the broad strokes of this type of material. Not only, infinite layers of Gnostic cosmology, but things like the divine feminine specifically, right? Stuff where, 5 years prior, 10 years prior, 20 years prior, it wouldn't even have occurred to me. And that was a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Yeah, just a note about that acknowledgement at the beginning. I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're a community, and to acknowledge that, we're all in it together and we don't do it alone. And I'm really fortunate enough in Australia to be supported by a fantastic community. Double thumbs up. Yes, Tim, thank you. But yeah, and to everyone in the community for being incredibly receptive and supportive of each other, and, allowing the kind of to have a platform where we can all have these open discussions, I think is really important. And I'm really grateful to be part of an organization that is kind of so proactive in that way.
I was just going to throw in, speaking of community, there's a comment from Mike saying he's new to Gnostic cosmology, and the lecture has given him a lot of food for thought. This is because Mike is local to me and has to listen to me every 2 weeks. So this is probably a step up in the quality that he's used to be perfectly honest. That was great. See, note the lack of denial.
Well, of course, as part of your community eminence, you have Deacon Angie, who is such an inspiration for me, particularly because she's such an immense resource, and a proponent of the divine feminine as well. So, Mike, I would definitely refer you to Deacon Angie because she has a lot of good stuff to say about the topic.
Thomas, you had a question.
Yes. But this has been really great. I'm very interested in Sethian Gnosticism and the Shekinah, the divine feminine, really into that. And I had been thinking that Sophia was the Holy Spirit. Somebody told me that was not so. So I'm glad to find out that it's actually Barbelo. But is it Barbelo that is speaking in Thunder Perfect Mind?
Oh, that's a great question. So what I didn't mention is that within the Sethian corpus, there are kind of some texts that are Sethian-ish or have a Sethian vibe, and the Thunder Perfect Mind is definitely one of those texts. So it's kind of within the broader Sethian lineage, but it's not actually. It hasn't been given that kind of title of being a Sethian text. Okay. But it's how incredible is Thunder Perfect Mind? You can see those kind of same principles or same kind of characteristics coming through in that text as well. So
yeah. I thought it was Sethian. Some people say it is, and then some others say it's not. Nobody knows what it is, but it's a great text. But on your do you have a website or something where you have recommended books? Because I'd really like to know more about this subject.
That reminded me, I did promise for the nerds here that I would give some resources. So let me just quickly share my screen again. So I will, here's some further reading for people who are interested. Unfortunately, within kind of Gnostic scholarship, the kind of writings about the divine feminine kind of really came to a head in the late 1980s. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, the images of the divine feminine in Gnosticism by Karen King. There was a lot of kind of discussion, and then everyone jumped on the Plato train, and that's fantastic, and I love that. But kind of the divine feminine, I guess, feminine studies within Gnosticism kind of, quietly slunk into the background. So I'm hoping to kind of bring that back into the fore again, and I'm hoping to do further study on that as well. So watch this space. But in this further reading, I've put some names of scholars here or some books to have a look at. And of course, I have to also mention that within the AJC, there is the Female Mystics group, if you're interested in female iterations of spirituality and mysticism. And we've kind of put that together the original purpose was to bring awareness to female spirituality and to get some female mystics and saints back onto the AJC calendar. But we've also got a website that I've listed below that kind of encapsulates all the work that we've done in that area if you're interested in kind of iterations and in the divine feminine.
Okay, and we'll get these slides, won't we?
I can make them available. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I might just stop sharing.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay.
I was just going to do a quick ad for, though not quite in the broader vein of the divine feminine, though not specifically dealing with Barbelo. If folks haven't seen it, there is the talk on Thunder Perfect Mind by Dr. Celine Lilly on our channel. And there's also Isis and Sophia by Isadora Forrest, which is... My computer just went.
Chris, currently, no, the group is not open to all, but we're possibly working on making it more inclusive in the future. That's why we have the website component so people can access the research that we're doing. No worries. And Bishop Tim has popped that in the chat as well. If you want to look at the page. Thanks, Tim.
Here's a kind of I guess just off the top of my head, now that I think about it, having gone through all that stuff, have you considered or did you do as a part of your digging into this? Did you contrast? I don't know I should know the cosmology enough, but I don't. But because you've contrasted Sophia and Barbelo and Isis in this, but I'm also wondering kind of in terms of possible parallels where Valentinian ideas align or do not align with this.
I haven't really done a lot of research into the kind of Valentinian cosmology. My kind of preference is the Sethians because I just find them so fascinating. Hopefully that kind of point came across in the talk today, but yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that in terms of the divine feminine, I think Sophia kind of becomes more prominent in the Valentinian cosmology, but that's kind of as like the extent of it as far as I know. I kind of defer to anyone else who's kind of more of a specialist in that area. Anyone else? Yeah.
As I say, unfortunately, or perhaps gratefully, none of us are experts. Any other questions? Comments? Fawning?
Well, it seemed to me like there was a lot of stuff in the chat there. I can't even keep up with it all.
Yeah.
Someone brought up the Thelemic deity Babylon. That may be kind of completely out of left field, but I don't know if you think there's any kind of connection there.
I'm not a Thelemite. I haven't really kind of delved into that cosmology, I guess. Off the top of my head, I've got no idea. Sorry. Yeah.
Might not be a good idea, but it is interesting.
Oh no, yeah, totally. I just don't have a good answer for that, I guess. Yeah, sorry.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you. That was bloody great. I would like to see us build up, I guess, a library, as it were, of things on the divine feminine, and we're slowly doing that, much in the same way that we've built up a small library of things on Sethian Gnosticism itself, between the fistful of scholars and, of course, the great work of Father Tony. I'd like to see us build up material on the divine feminine. We do have a few pieces along that line, and I think this is going to be an excellent addition to it. I can't get enough of this stuff, particularly because I'm so used to dealing with forests that sometimes I forget to look at the trees, which of course is how we get the thing. So thank you kindly. That was great.
Thank you.
For everybody in general here, this is our last talk for the evening. So everyone is free now to go to more air-conditioned rooms, which is what I'm going to do.